former FEMA director James Lee Witt. And at 10, another chance to see authors and photographers taking questions from New Orleans residents. That's 12 hours of book TV, this Sunday beginning at noon Eastern on C-SPAN 2.
In his book, Neoconservatism, BBC commentator Douglas Murray argues that the Bush administration's foreign policy is the best way to handle terrorism. This talk from the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C. is about an hour, 10 minutes.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the director of the Center for European Studies here at the Hudson Foundation Institute, and on behalf of the Institute, I would like to welcome you here. I think it's a tribute both to the topic today and to our speaker. We've such a large and distinguished crowd in the dog days of August, so welcome in from the warm. We're very fortunate in having Douglas Murray as our speaker today for two reasons. One is that Mr. Murray is one of those writers who seem to, like Minerva springing fully armed from the head of Zeus, who seems to have arrived as a young man in the world with an enormous amount to his credit in a very few years. He first of all wrote a biography of Bosie, the friend of Oscar Wilde, when he was still an undergraduate at Magdalen, and secondly, he has now produced a book on the topic of neoconservatism. In between these times, he's become a fellow of the Social Affairs Unit in England, and to those of you who don't know about the Social Affairs Unit in England, which I do know quite well, it is an organization which has managed to produce, in a sense, a more imaginative and lively account of social theory from a conservative standpoint than almost any other institution, and it does so on, I think it's fair to say, and this is not meant to be a libel but a compliment, on a shoestring budget. So I think that to be associated with the Social Affairs Unit is, I think, a high mark of credit. Now, Mr. Murray's second book, and the one we're discussing today, is on the topic of neoconservatism. And neoconservatism, I think it's fair to say, and again, this is not meant to be a critical remark, but it's fair to say that in Washington, at least, it's past its high noon. And it has come under severe criticism from realists and from others on the left. Now, Mr. Murray is a devotee of it. I'm going to raise a couple of questions in question time which suggest that he is somewhat heterodox neoconservative in Washington terms, but certainly he's not a representative, I should say, but he's one of a number of people in England who in recent years, at the time when neoconservatism is perhaps more criticized in England than it is over here, who has emerged as the standard bearer of that idea, and done so along with groups like the Henry Jackson Society and the Euston Statement Group, people on the left and on the right, though he is on the right, who've emerged to champion this theory. Now, when we first asked him to speak, we were asking him to speak on the topic, which at the time seemed the right way to approach it: can a European be a neoconservative? Since neoconservatism was generally presented as a specifically American concept and idea. But in view of what's happened in the last month, both in the Middle East, but also I think in London in the last week, I think it's fair to say to ask the question rather of whether or not neoconservatism is now, so to speak, reviving, coming back. Are not the reasons why it was originally adopted beginning to look strong again, rather than being weakened by the Iraq War and other events? So we really rather asked Mr. Murray to switch his emphasis, and he's going to now speak on the topic why neoconservatism still matters. The topic of his book, by the way, is why neoconservatism matters. So, with great pleasure, I ask Mr. Murray to address us.
Thank you very much, John O'Sullivan, and also to the Hudson Institute for inviting me to speak to you today. The subject of my talk has indeed changed slightly, but I hope I get some of all of these matters in. One of the things I hear more than anything else here in the United States is more of a statement than a question. With a mixture of sort of bafflement and amusement, I hear the words, "You're a European neoconservative?" I understand some of the bemusement. Many people here find it surprising that I don't object to association with a word that carries so many overtones of wickedness and dark dealings, but I do object, and would very much appreciate it if people didn't refer to me as a European. Of course, the British have never, historically or popularly, felt part of Europe, and today, as for many years, we have more in common with the average American than with the average Frenchman. The British attitude perhaps being best summed up by that famous headline around the time of the last war, when storms had raged for days in the English Channel and shipping had been prevented from coming through, and one of the British papers, entirely unironically, ran the immortal headline, "Storms in Channel, Continent Cut Off." But having raised this quibble at an early stage, and whether we are now cut off from the continent or not, I'm willing to temporarily partake in the pretense, and will talk to you today as though the fact that I come from Britain means that I come from Europe. And that objection having been registered, I can get to the substance. I was originally asked to address the question of whether a European can be a neoconservative. But the answer to that question is obviously yes, and in the wake of the unfolding of the UK terror plot, I'd like to look at that question in a slightly different way and ask, rather, can a European, or indeed an American, afford not to be a neoconservative today? This requires me first to sort out a definition. Irving Kristol's famous remark that neocon was a liberal who'd been mugged by reality stopped applying perfectly some time ago. The change came about not only because what Americans today call liberals are very far from being liberals, but also because the most prominent neocons today were often never liberals in the first place, or were, in many cases, in fact, I'm thinking particularly of figures like perhaps Bill Kristol and John Podritz here, were born neoconservatives. The definition I like to use relies on people firstly understanding the obvious truth that neoconservatism is not a cabal or a party, but rather a sense, an instinct, a way of looking at the world. That way of looking at the world is, in my definition, a blend of idealism and realism. We look at the world as it is, but act in the world to make it as we would like it to be. This makes our instincts different from traditional conservatives who often distrust social engineering projects or any form of alteration of a status quo they perpetually see as being an irreversible, if often quietly enjoyable, decline. And of course, it makes us different from modern-day liberals who simply don't see the world as it is. I say that neocons look at the world through an idealist's eyes, but wear heavy and powerful glasses. We're moralists with good eyesight. As such, I believe that neoconservatism is the most valuable and indeed necessary political outlook of our time. I should point out here, I'm not terribly worried about offending or alienating what you call liberals and I call socialists, people for whom, in any case, alienation like self-flagellation seems to be a pleasure as well as a principle. But before offending any conservatives any further, I would like to stress that I see old-school conservatism not as wrong in itself, but largely merely tactically wrong. As primarily an instinct and almost a non-philosophy, old-style conservatism today has, to my mind, two major flaws. The first is that conservatism relies on a noble sense of loyalty to the status quo. But the status quo, as we know in much of the West today, has changed, especially in Western institutions, and thanks to socialist interferers, they've largely changed very much for the worse. This being the case, the instinctive conservative is now often left trying to feel loyalty to a status quo that is not his status quo. That is, he's left trying to feel loyal to things which have not been loyal to him. I greatly sympathize with people caught in this dilemma. As an Anglican, I'm, like many Anglicans today, left permanently caught between the desire to express loyalty to what one regards as a true faith, and at the same time experiencing rage and bafflement at a church hierarchy which has thrown out the Book of Common Prayer, the King James Bible, and aspires, it often appears, to become little more than Greenpeace at prayer. This process follows the same track as many institutions to which conservatives would like to show loyalty, but increasingly cannot. In this situation, a conservative has an unenviable task. He either has to try continuing to be loyal to institutions which are disloyal to him, or he has to stop being a conservative and become that seeming anathema, a radical conservative, a revolutionary conservative, I believe a neoconservative. The other reason why neoconservatism has a particular urgency today lies in the fact that instinctive conservatism on its own has proved woefully inadequate against the machinations and trickery of the left. Faced with someone performing the wicked but occasionally flashy acrobatics of the left, the instinctive conservative is often left feeling and looking outperformed and rather befuddled. Confronted by poseurs and con artists of the page, like Foucault and Chomsky, the instinctive conservative sense of natural right and moral certainty, though not disproved, is made to look to a new generation desperately unsophisticated and therefore provably wrong. In an age where the pretense of moral as well as mental sophistication matters more than the thing itself, I think this is an especially dangerous lacuna. Neoconservatism, by contrast, as I explain in the book, is a conservative philosophy